president of the Middle East Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to today's event about ending Israel's occupation while enhancing Israel's sovereignty, or security, and realizing Palestinian sovereignty. That it's based on a report that our panelists have written, and I hope you have picked up copies outside. We have a terrific group of speakers with us today. We're looking forward to a lively discussion with them and with you, our audience. I want to thank you for coming out on a Friday afternoon at the end of a very exhausting Washington work week. Now I know it was really hardcore here in Washington, so I appreciate your support. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank George and Rhonda Salem, the George and Rhonda Salem Family Foundation, for their support of this panel. We've done 6 panels on the Arab-Israeli conflict with the Salem family, and we look forward to more programming on this very important topic. I'd also like to bring to your attention our new MEI initiative and website, the Arab Transitions Initiative. It's an effort to really shine a spotlight on the historic transformations taking place in the Arab world and coming out of the protests of 2011. And I'd like to direct you to that site. You can get to it through our main site, mei.edu, and there you'll find original analysis and writings from experts and authors based in the region, shedding light on the new dynamics emerging out of Egypt, which is what we're focusing on for the first several months. And because we want to make it a little more exciting, we've produced a lot of interactives. We've got a great Egyptian political party interactive. We've got a dedicated, curated news feed out of the Arab world. We've got photo galleries, and we've got great subtitled Arabic video. We're featuring the Egyptian satirist Bassem Youssef, who's been making great fun of the Morsi government. So go check it out and have a good laugh, and I'd love to hear your feedback. I also want to encourage you to pick up a copy of the Middle East Journal out in the lobby. There's an article by Geoffrey Aronson based on, or examining, the U.S.-Israel-Palestine relationship. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Ambassador Phil Wilcox, who will be steering today's event. Phil is the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, as well as a scholar at MEI. He served 31 years in the State Department, retiring in 1997, with his last mission being Chief of Mission and Consul General in Jerusalem, hence his great knowledge of this topic. So I want to thank Phil, Ambassador Pickering, Geoffrey Aronson, and Mr. Denning for joining us today for this fabulous panel, and now I'd like to hand it over to you, Phil. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you all for coming. A special welcome, and we're honored to have in our presence the Ambassador of the Arab League. Welcome, sir. I need not tell you that Israel's policy for many decades and its current policy of occupation and settlement of the West Bank is a product of a very complex and troubled history. It has its origins in many centuries of fear by the Jewish people and deep insecurity. It is driven by religious factors, by ideology, and it has both contributed to and suffered from a conflict of many decades with the Arabs and with the Palestinians. The conflict now is largely reduced, I think, to the struggle between the Israeli state and the Israeli national movement and the Palestinian national movement. Many, indeed probably most impartial observers today think that there is a solution to the long-standing conflict, although it is perhaps a fleeting one, but that is in the division of the historic land of Palestine between the State of Israel and a new state of Palestine. Everyone, I think, understands the traditional insecurity of the Jewish people and of the state of Israel for many reasons. And that if there is to be a comprehensive peace based on two states, there will have to be built into it solid and credible security arrangements for the Israelis, and that will be essential to ensure real sovereignty and independence for the Palestinians in a state of their own. So those two requirements are the topic for the forum today. We have a distinguished panel. Ambassador Tom Pickering, I needn't give you his full CV because it would take many pages to do so. I had the pleasure of serving with Tom when he was the ambassador to Israel, when I was the director for Israeli affairs, and later the American Consul General in Jerusalem. Tom is a 6-time U.S. ambassador. He was Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and on and on. He most recently chaired an accountability review board inquiry into the Benghazi tragedy, and he is the vice chair of Hill and Company. Geoffrey Aronson, my colleague at the Foundation for Middle East Peace, is the director for publications and research and the editor for our bi-monthly report on Israeli settlement in the occupied territories. And Phil Dermer is a retired U.S. Army colonel. He said he had just flown in from Bangkok, where he's living with his wife. Phil has had many assignments in the military and in the civilian realm. He is an expert on the security issues. So we're delighted that they have given their time to talk to us this afternoon. They will speak for about an hour, after which we'll have time for Q's and A's. I ask that we focus on questions and answers about the topic at hand, and we'll leave some time at the end for questions on other topics which just might arise. Thanks again for coming, and I'm going to ask Geoffrey Aronson to speak for about 10 minutes. I'm going to start. You want to start, Tom? Okay, good.
Yeah. We're eminently flexible, and first let me thank you, Phil and Kate, for the opportunity to come together with you in this particularly important place. And to say that this report grew out of a set of ideas and thoughts that Jeff and I shared, and then Colonel Dermer came in with us, and then many others. And the principal question at hand was precisely the question that you so beautifully outlined. Israel, for many years, has been concerned about security. Security has become, in a sense, a basic watchword, up to the point where it was almost unquestionable. And we felt that in any Middle East peace, all issues should be subject to question. They should be subject to rational analysis, and they should be subject to a sense that compromise was not necessarily an inevitable disaster, but it was, in a sense, a way of further enriching the commitment of both parties to a process which, over a long period of time, would do that. There was a logical and, I think, serious Palestinian counterpart, their sovereignty. And in the discussions that have taken place frequently in public, the issue was always, in my view, heavily weighted toward the direction that Palestinian sovereignty could be waved aside if the issue of Israeli security was asserted. And that may be too harsh a statement, but in any event, it appeared to me to have begun to take that form, and I was worried about that. We, in the course of this process, then began to look as much as we could into this issue, not just in the area of analysis of what were the major Israeli security concerns, and I think we took a very broad view of that. It was not an effort in any way to try to chivvy those down so much as to see where they came and how they fitted on the table. We had the opportunity to speak with, and indeed to benefit from papers done by a number of Israeli experts who some from the IDF who had looked at this particular problem from their own perspective over a period of years. And we had the opportunity to talk to Palestinians. We had the opportunity to talk to a number of people elsewhere closely associated with the process and how it had proceeded and how it had moved ahead. Out of this initial look came, I think very clearly, one of the fundamental propositions in the report, and both Jeff and PJ will outline for you some of the details of that, because I think it's important that throughout this process and looking at the security dimension of a peace process, one important aspect could well be both U.S. and third country involvement in place in the region and in the area concerned to provide a monitoring and verification capacity that would in itself serve both as an opportunity to deal with anything that looked like it was a violation of the agreement, while at the same time their presence on the ground would hopefully reinforce the commitment of the parties to stay with the agreement. And this is a traditional and indeed regular function of peacekeeping coming out of the process that grew up in the 50s and 60s in the United Nations, the kind of brainchild of a then British Undersecretary General of the United Nations. We did not attempt in this piece of paper, to the disappointment of a number of audiences to which we have presented it, try to solve all of the problems of Arab-Israeli peace. We decided early on that that was a significant enough task that it had to rest with the governments concerned and indeed the people who would be negotiating it. But it was an effort to take a look at one particular piece that seemed to us to have had too little examination to date. Maybe we're wrong, and some here well may feel that the papers they have authored provide a much better alternative, and we certainly are prepared to accept the fact that despite the fact that we have a certain sense of pride and maybe even genius quality about this particular report, certainly not me, but Jeff and PJ do, that we should at the same time be open and frank and clear that it was an effort to try to put together both an assessment of an issue and then to take a look at how that might affect negotiations, and then how the introduction of third country balancing efforts, particularly the United States, could play a constructive and useful role to achieve the multiple objectives. That is, find a strong way to assure that Israeli security concerns were being taken care of, while at the same time made it clear that it would be done in full respect of Palestinian sovereignty. It, in a number of places, suggests that a one-size-fits-all, totally one-directional solution is obviously not going to be readily accepted by either party, but that there are places in the report where it holds the door open, as it should, for negotiated arrangements. But it attempts to state a series of principles or thoughts or ideas that hopefully could guide a negotiating process and meet the test of justice and fairness in that kind of a process, while also meeting the test that it does meet the needs of the parties with respect to these issues. There is no question at all that two other issues are there. They're the logical counterpart questions. Can and should we meet the needs of Palestinian security? Of course. They tend to be sublimated, somehow ignored, and sometimes pushed aside. And can we also guarantee, or at least strive, fully to respect the sovereignty of the State of Israel? Of course. The Israelis are strong defenders of those principles and those ideas, but it was not, in our judgment, necessary to produce a paper that in fact had a whole series of steps or compromises in which you immediately assumed that one side would give on one side of the equation a great deal and the other side would give on the other side of the equation a great deal. It was our hope that we could, parabolou dictu, square the circle on these kinds of questions. That, in fact, there would be ideas that we felt could mutually respect both sovereignty and security on both sides. And so while we focused on the issues that seem to have meant the most up until now to both parties, because they perhaps represented areas in the negotiation and the discussions about the negotiations that gave the most difficulty, they were, at least in my view, put into a position in the paper which attempted to try to respect those. Others among you may find faults or errors in your view of these, and these are what we hope to discuss with you in the question and answer period that will come up. I would say one only other thing. There is a great deal of attention to the United States, maybe more than needs to be there, and the role that we believe the United States could play. I happen to see this as important because, in effect, despite changes in attitudes toward the U.S. in the region, when it comes down to it, both sides all seem to believe, despite what are clearly slippages in the polls, if I can put it that way, in U.S. popularity, the U.S. still has an important role to play. I also believe that the U.S. in many ways can be a convener of a group that we call the International Monitoring and Verification Force, or Commission, that could be truly multilateral. And I think in its true multilateral approach, one could look as well at participation that went beyond just NATO allies. And there might be useful places for participation of Arab states. There might well be useful participation of Israelis in some of the activities here in order to build and strengthen the process. And finally, while in effect we looked at this in a sort of static mode, there is very clear in the paper itself, and I think over time, that what you begin with is not necessarily what you stay with for the whole process. That is, it might be much more robust in some activities at the beginning, and as hopefully good behavior and better accommodation and change takes place, presences would be reduced, that issues that were seen to be fiercely fought over in negotiations might recede. Others might pop up and you would have to be flexible. So that the whole particular approach, I think, also has to be governed by the rule of flexibility. Well, I blathered on long enough here. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jeff. And Jeff will set the stage, and Jeff is going to particularly, I think, present some ideas, particularly about the U.S. role and how and in what way it fits together. And Jeff, the field is yours, and I'm always surprised not only by the brilliance of your presentation, but by the new ideas you sneak in. It's all yours.
That's because as I get older, I forget what I thought and believed the day previously, so I have to constantly reinvent.
You should take constant strength from the fact that you're nowhere near my age.
Okay.
But it's an aspiration I hold dear. Thank you all for coming. I'd also like to thank, above and beyond those who have already been thanked, the government of Norway, which generously has supported and funded our effort, and whose day today happens to be National Day. So because of that, and because we're here today, I think on both counts, Norway can stand proud. We've been briefing this report and the ideas that are in it for a number of months now. And when I began to do it, I would start by saying that what we're trying to sell is like selling ice cream to Norwegians in January. That is, there wasn't much of a market. But I also said at the time, inevitably January becomes July, and then people begin to line up for ice cream. Well, if we want to continue with that metaphor, you know, John Kerry is really the ice cream seller today, right? And it attests to the remaining ability, as Tom said, of the United States with very little effort, at least until now, to transform the environment. So that, for example, the introduction that I might have offered in November, I can't say any longer today. Because I can't say today that people are bored with the conflict, with the same kind of certainty that was the case in November of last year, for example. If only because the U.S. Secretary of State has decided to make it a priority of his to re-engage on the issue of peace and negotiations and to try to improve the atmosphere, certainly over and above what had been the case for many months, if not years. So that's an important point, and one of the points that we stress is the unchallenged ability of the U.S. to transform the environment. And one shouldn't minimize the extent to which U.S. effort can encourage, can convey the necessity for reevaluating and reassessing long-held positions, which over the years have produced stalemate. The second point, and that flows from the first, is it was our belief, having looked at this issue over many decades, that left to themselves, the parties themselves are incapable of coming to an agreement. Even the good offices that countries like the U.S. have offered episodically over the years have been inadequate to the task, in the sense that we failed to reach an agreement that ends occupation, creates a Palestinian sovereign state, at peace with the state of Israel within secure and recognized borders. So something more is required. It's not like we need to do the same thing over and over again and expect a new outcome. That's the second point, that the parties themselves can't do it, and the traditional tools that third parties have used have been inadequate to the task. The third point is that the U.S., as a consequence, needs to take an active, and I would argue more active, role in shaping the future in a manner that reflects the vital national security interests of the U.S. in an agreement, and which also is complemented by the interests of both, the shared interests of both Israelis and Palestinians in an agreement along the lines that we suggest. The fourth point is a point that is contrasted with the traditional view that the Obama administration in particular, but U.S. administrations in general have put forward over the years, which is we can't want an agreement more than the parties themselves. Our argument is that if the vital interests of the United States are at stake, as we believe they are, and as the U.S. administration itself argues, you cannot leave satisfaction of those interests hostage to the inability of the parties themselves to reach an agreement. It's a contradiction at the heart of the enterprise. So in contrast to what this administration has suggested, although we haven't heard this lately, the U.S. has to be at least prepared to want an agreement more than the parties themselves. Otherwise, you risk letting the inmates run the asylum. Okay? So just to summarize that important point, a vital national interest of the U.S. in an agreement requires the U.S. to be prepared to want an agreement more than the parties themselves. Otherwise, we're just whistling in the wind here. But why now? Why did we write this now? in part because the Middle East, as we all can see and cannot avoid seeing, is shaking under our feet in oh so many ways. An old order, of course, is dying every day, and a new one is being born. And either you're an agent of that effort or you're the object. Right? History is merciless in its judgment, and if you don't lead the train from forward or even from behind, you're going to be following in its wake. So that although there are dangers today, there are also certainly opportunities. And our point of departure is to take advantage of this instability, if you will, to shape a future, to take a leadership role in shaping a future which will recognize and stabilize the interests, the basic vital interests of these three major parties, and we could add some if we wanted, Israel, the U.S., Palestinians, in the kind of agreement we suggest. What are the U.S. interests here? Okay. In our view, the United States aspires to establish a stable regional environment in which the threats and the use of the threats of force are minimized, and where appropriate means are in place to successfully confront unilateral efforts of any party to undermine stability. The national interests of the U.S. are best served in an environment which is open for trade, investment, and cooperation, and supported, and this is the contribution I think we need to make here, supported by robust mutual security needs. Mutual security has been notably absent in the structures of Middle East security and peace as they've been imagined over the last decades. In the 50s, there was an attempt at this. For those of you or us whose memories or academic interests go that far back, but they were anti-communist in origin, and the mutual security was sort of phony in that respect. Anyway, the idea of mutual security, if you read this report, which is here in hard copy, it's available on the Foundation for Middle East website, and if you don't have the interest or the stamina to read the whole thing, the Middle East Journal has kindly allowed me to give us a smaller version of it, which is still hard to digest, but more manageable. That's one important aspect of U.S. security interest. The next one is in a sense more obvious. The U.S. has a national interest in the state of Israel, existing as a secure and independent nation in which its citizens are free to determine their own future. For Israel to be part of this stable regional environment, at peace with its neighbors, democratic, and with secure and recognized boundaries, this requires Israel to end the occupation and to enable the people of Palestine to fulfill their national desires. An agreement that enhances Israeli security and enables the exercise of Palestinian sovereignty is our key objectives for U.S. policy. They're not contradictory, they're mutually supportive, and they are the foundation and building blocks for a stable regional environment in which the interests of all parties can be met. The U.S. in particular has an interest in welcoming the state of Palestine as a sovereign state in the family of sovereign nations. This will enable the people of Palestine to exercise national self-determination and freely choose their own destiny, pursuing national reconstruction and devising a solution, or more than one, to decades of dispersion and diaspora, in an environment characterized by peaceful and mutually beneficial relations with its neighbors. Now, Many of you may say, these guys are smoking something here. This all sounds really nice. It does sound great. I admit that. And maybe that's a shortcoming in today's environment, so, but we'll have to pay that price. But we aren't coming to this issue with stars in our eyes. The folks who have played a central role in articulating these notions have spent careers and lifetimes on the front lines of diplomacy and on the battlefield, and have paid and exercised personal prices and personal judgment to try to make that part of the world a better place. So I think that experience is important, and again, it reinforces the determination that's expressed in this effort here to try to recalibrate or reimagine the kinds of principles that are required if we have any hope of breaking out of this circle of never-ending conflict and stalemate. Let's see where we go next. Why don't I skip that? Why don't I skip that? Let me make a couple of points here. There's no doubt that Israel will experience security concerns, as will the state of Palestine, in the aftermath of an agreement. It's our firm view, based on our reading of the history of the region and of Israel's own decisions itself, that the withdrawal of its military forces from occupied territory, the withdrawal of all of its settlements from those territories as part of an agreement, enhances Israel's security and does not detract from it. Yes. This is the historical truth that remains despite the problems in Sinai today, and even despite the problems in Gaza today. If you speak to Israeli security professionals, the view is Israel's security has been enhanced as a consequence of these decisions that Israel has made throughout its history. Far more so than remaining in occupied territory, settling territory in a zero-sum game at tremendous cost to its own interests, certainly to the interests of those who were the objects of that. The second point we make here is the continuing deployment of Israeli forces in a sovereign state of Palestine is, in our view, a disproportionate and a destabilizing response to challenges that can be better addressed without compromising Palestinian sovereignty. And PJ is going to address this next. There should be no Israeli presence in sovereign Palestinian areas unless agreed to by the parties. Now, this is not a favor to Palestine. This is a favor to both parties. The demand for absolute security by one party ensures the absolute insecurity of the other party. What we're interested in doing is developing a framework of relationships which is grounded and stable. That kind of absolute satisfaction of one party's interests at the expense of the other is a recipe for instability. In Israel, in Palestine, in Europe, in Zimbabwe, and somewhere else, doesn't matter. Absolute security for one is insecurity for the other, and that produces instability for the whole. Okay? Our suggestion, as a means of mitigating the concerns that will arise as we create a new security framework, is to establish what PJ has called the IMVO, the International Monitoring and Verification Organization. Why don't I let PJ explain what that is?
Good afternoon. My name is PJ Dermer, retired Army Colonel. Started out in the infantry, became an aviator, and then in the military we have to, midway through our career, we have to pick a secondary specialty. I didn't pick mine, they picked me to be a Middle East foreign area officer. And I say that because in college, in college I was backpacking and I went through the Lebanese Civil War and Hama 1. I was in the first Hama debacle in 1982. I just happened to tell a few people that one night. The next thing I know, they said, "We've decided what your secondary will be when you grow up." And I said, "Thanks, you're killing me." And that came true as well. I thank Ambassador Wilcox, the MEI, Ambassador Pickering. It was a sheer joy to work with. As Tom said, Jeff said, one of the benefits of the beauties of this project is all three of us could name every town and every river and wadi. And I remember this negotiation. I remember that. So we all knew. The editing was very easy. That didn't happen here. I was there. Okay. Well, this one didn't happen there. Why? Oh, I was there. Oh, okay. So we hope that this project is, although it's grandiose in its claim and it reaches out a little bit. I mean, it challenges current theses. Is that this is not based on trying to win ideas. This is based on trying to how to make this happen. So for my part, as we work together on the intellectual part, the first part, the second part wasn't great. How do you make this happen? Well, there's no golden bell. How do you make this happen? But I did sit down with Jeff and Ambassador Pickering and said, look, I have a pretty good idea after all these years. I've done 4 tours out there. 2 as an attaché, 2 as peacekeeping, both a UN role and an MFO role. Okay, and I've also been to school there and I've traveled extensively there. I said, I've seen enough of these different things in the merry-go-round that we might be able to piece something together that just might work. But let me give it a try, and then what I came up with the IBMO. So the first thing I tell you, conceptually how I came up with this, while you can read the actual document, is this was not done in a vacuum. I mean, there was a vision behind it, and the vision was strategy, which the United States of America has trouble grappling sometimes. It wasn't tactical, it was strategy. Jeff and I and Ambassador Pickering and the group laid out the strategy, and then we said, well, how do we connect the strategy to realities on the ground? Think of it as design build, not where the architect comes up with an award-winning drawing and the builder sees the architectural drawing and goes, you gotta be kidding me. Who drew this? We can't do this. This is not gonna happen. Oh, really? So it's very simplified along that line. So the first point I would just make is having a vision of where we wanted to go. And in this case, it's the grand strategy was U.S. interest. That was the rubric, U.S. interest. Yeah, we know the interest of the parties. It's a dead horse. But how about our interests? Why don't we act for our interests? Okay, that's why you'll see when you get to the line and block chart, it's pretty robust. Well, there's a reason. If you're talking strategy, you got to be prepared to back up what you want to do. If you're talking tactics, you can have an office and a nameplate and some cars, and that's as far as we'll get. We're not doing that. We very much consider the realities on the ground. Okay, now what do I mean by realities on the ground? Well, of course, that's a PhD paper. It means by the years of experience that we've all been there in some form or another. We put those together. We collided with each other. We juggled. We had inertia and kinetic energy and whatnot. And said, well, if you're going to do this, and I've seen this, you're going to do this. Now, a lot of the things, a lot of the precedent that's in our paper has UN, EU, BAM, from the AMA agreement and all that. You can all say, as Jeff has rightly pointed out, none of those have worked. Well, yes and no. In the grand strategic role of things, we have not achieved nirvana in Middle East peace. I get that. But all along the way, on the graph, you have high points. They just weren't followed through. They just weren't exploited. But you do have high points. So something somewhere at given times and place works, or I would argue more appropriately opens the door, and no one followed through. But the door is open, so we have evidence of that. It's one thing to interview the great leaders, of the Palestinian Authority, the United States, Israel, but in this case, because of the connections that I've developed over the years, and Jeff and some of my other partners in the room, we went down to that level as well. I mean, if Art Linkletter, every kid, I forgot what his saying was, but they say the darndest things. Well, soldiers that are actually working at the coordinator for the government activities in the territory, the major in charge of the Joint Operations Center in Ramallah, you name it, have all lived through this process their entire lives. It's not like the American Army, we're flying to some country, we got to figure this out while we're fighting. No, everyone's grown up. They've all grown up in this process. I mean, from the time of birth to the time they put on whatever they do. They have ideas, and they always wonder why folks in our positions can never get it right, and how we come up with these so much goofy ideas. So, we went out to that level as well, and I thought it was very, very revealing. A couple of uniquenesses of the report. Like I said, it does fit in with the realities. There's two things that became clear throughout, and I think it's clear throughout all the material if you study this subject. A third-party mechanism is part of the deal. It's not, will there be, can it, no. There is, in any one of these moments in time and in the future, a third-party mechanism. All right? So I think that's a sound thesis. Somebody will have to be there, because this conflict has gone on too long. It's gotten too rough. The basic overall trust is not there. The history's too rough. Something somehow is going to be there, if not a wall. Now, we have a wall. We have the wall that runs to the West Bank now. We have the wall going up around Gaza. We're still not there. So in essence, a third-party mechanism is recognized both sides. So it's a fair argument as a starting point for us. The difference, again, with us, we start is we have a strategy, and my part, IVMO, IMBO, is the operational how-to. I argue, and I haven't had this argument with these gentlemen yet, but I would love to. As you see the Middle East peace process and others, there's no shortage of papers and libraries. If you go to any university, go to the Middle East section, it's eye-watering. I mean, what hasn't been written about this? And that's a fair argument against what we're doing again, but you know, it's nice as an operator to write. The difference here is, and I'll use the roadmap as an example. I haven't had to dissect that page by page, both in the Pentagon, the White House, and out in the field. You couldn't figure it out. You understood the political nuance behind it. You understood the political necessity. You understood the guy, you know, I know the guys that wrote it, most of it. But then when the document is then stapled and taken forward, I got to tell you, it's hard to know where to begin. And of course, the essence of that is the first phase of security. Okay, so we're focusing on that. But I mean, when you break it down, it's not an operational document. You can't give it to a group, even soldiers that like to do great things, or a firm, I don't care who they are, and say, okay, here's your design build. We designed it, now you build this. It's not going to happen. And well, in fact, it hasn't. We didn't want to do that. We wanted to say, okay, here's our strategy. Yeah, controversial, not, makes sense, doesn't. Okay, then here's how you want to do it. The IMBO is not a catch-all. It's not a panacea. It's a means to an end, and I think it's sound. Because very simply, it's a large, rather robust, not large, human presence on the ground, U.S.-led. And this is the second point. The first point was third-party mechanisms, going to happen. The second point is the U.S.-led. You heard Ambassador Tom note that, Jeff never did. When you do the research, you do the study, you do the beer after hours, or tea in the coffee house, it's got to be somewhere at the most senior levels, not senior, a U.S.-sponsored, pushed, driven mechanism. Now, we've got angst feedback from this from a lot of our coalition partners. I'm not arguing with the thesis. You know, for one that's been on these battlefields for a lot of years, to include the recent ones, I'd be glad to sit this one out. I'd be glad to watch it on reality TV. But at the end of the day, the United States has to have, if not the key role. It's why in the MFO we have a 2-star currently from New Zealand, but the chief of staff of that organization, purposely so, is the United States officer, and the head of the organization in Rome is the United States retired Foreign Service Officer Senior. There's a reason for that. And you know, it's not worth us trying to get around. Also, we take on, as Tom said, we actually broke down the major issues surrounding the security conundrum, all the little working groups. We read the Geneva Initiative, we read the Yalom study. We have some other studies that we read. I've been in all the peacekeeping organizations. I've been in the senior levels of this country doing this stuff. We looked at them and said, okay, we got to make it very simple. But we do have to give a U.S. position. If you're going to put forth the U.S. strategy, as Ambassador Pickering said, we're not putting this out there to initiate, as everyone in this room knows, a long, drawn-out negotiation process over each one of the subsets, which is currently where we are now. I mean, anyone that's seen these things and been part of them, every meeting has a meeting and a subgroup and a sub-subgroup. No, we're not doing that. We're stating a U.S. priority of interest for each subject. I'll throw one out there. Jeff already did. No Israeli presence in the occupied West Bank. That's pretty bold, but that's the United States determination as a starting base for this organization. It's a negotiation part. Yeah, well, listen, but it became very clear to me doing the research in years is both parties have told us, please take away our excuses. Please if you give it to us, you're gonna get an answer. As a commander once told me, if you seek guidance, you're gonna get it. All right? You are the United States of America. We want to hear from you. We want to see what you want to do, and we want you to see you back it up. Okay, well that doesn't, then we put all these things on the table and say, okay, we'll be back tomorrow. Monday we'll do water. Tuesdays, hell no, we're not doing that. Okay, that's some of the intent behind what we've written up. Very importantly, 2 more things. There's no boots on the ground. When you see the number of boxes, you see the number of organizations in there, there's not a military uniform member with a gun, which is contrary to everything out there today so far, and we heard some great pushback from the Israelis when we showed them, okay, all right. You know, we don't want to go there, and we believe that given the systems today, given the essence that this is pretty much post-agreement, and pretty much as long as you have the strategic backing, actually the decision drive from the United States, the essence of a uniformed force, which has always heretofore been important, UN, MFO, EU, you name it, we're saying no, and you don't need it. As Tom said, though, it is a flexible report. I see what's happening in the Arab world. We're why everyone's watching Jordan next to Syria. Look, Jordan terms, okay, the kingdom is no longer the great friend that it is today. Okay, we can revisit it, but that's the beauty of this report. But right now, in the current stationing in the Middle East, no. We don't think that's necessary. And last but not least, this is, you know, because you're right, you get to have a pet peeve, okay? My pet peeve was, let's have although the organization is quite robust, and I think she would be led or headed by a great American like Tom or Ambassador Wilcox, the consultative mechanisms, the mechanism where you deal with issues, is very slim. Why? We want things to be handled right where they are. If you got an argument at Kearney, you got an argument at Kerem Shalom, you got an argument at Allenby Bridge, you got an issue, deal with it. The last thing we want to do, as this process is so long held, is form a body of great senior Americans to get the Israelis and the Palestinians, everybody in the room, to start hashing these things out. Because just like I argued before, it'll turn into its own essence, its own front. We don't want to do that. Tom and Phil should be an issue that just, you know, needs to be at their level, and there shouldn't be that many of those. Once the agreement is agreed that this is in place, an organization, trust me, great folks on the ground, in between and among the parties, with the parties, can do wonders when they know what they're doing. And this week, you didn't have the report, but we did say around the table, it would be great, God forbid, if we can start this thing off with people that understand the region and know what's going on. You know, Afghanistan and Iraq was the pinnacle of come one, come all. Hey, you want to go to Iraq, want to go to Afghanistan? Sure. Nor do we know the damage that's been done by the unknowing. We don't want that here. These parties have seen every kind of color and shape come in. It'd be great if someone could come on the ground and get it. And oh my God, this guy gets it. Okay, we get it. Thank you.
Thank you to all 3 of you for describing the study, describing the need for it, and why it would take us beyond where we are now. I'd like to invite the audience to ask questions or make brief comments, addressing them to anyone on the panel you wish. Please identify yourselves. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Paulette Lee. I'm a communications consultant, and I thank you for your remarks. My question is, how can we be sure that the United States is going to take a balanced approach to intervening or mitigating or moderating the peace, so-called peace process, when in fact the public statements that we typically hear are about us being a great friend of Israel and validating the right of the Israeli state to exist, but not about being a great friend of the Palestinians and validating the right of a Palestinian state to exist. Those are not said with the equal emphasis. So I question the objectivity of the U.S. in this process. Thank you.
It's a great question. it, in my view, points to some of the failings of recent policy. The paper is based on a premise that the United States and others can be helpful in resolving issues that would come up in the implementation of a peace agreement by a balanced view. It is clear that that balanced view will be shaped by the agreement between the parties, not something pulled out of thin air and merely kind of pushed forward. So in many ways, the fundamental issues will be first resolved by the parties. There are differences of view about where the commander's car should park or how many trucks go through today, I believe can be easily translated into what should be and ought to be an impartial, fair, and equitable approach. But it is, in effect, asking soldiers in the first instance and civilians to have the wisdom of judges and to have the impartiality of carrying out an arrangement which the parties have put together. We believe it can be done. We believe that properly inspired people will do that. And we believe still that on both sides, despite what I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks about the decline in American credibility, there isn't anybody else around on the one side who believes, because our influence is so large with the other, that we could have a positive effect if we wanted to, and on the other side, because we are obviously committed to their security and survival, that we would be unfair. Hopefully we can rise to the occasion. I don't see another situation, another approach to this, otherwise we would have adopted it, which we feel can work. We could certainly go to Ouija boards, we could go to roulette wheels, we could go to a lot of other things, but I don't think, in fact, they offer this kind of alternative. But I agree with you that it will mean, in effect, that our people will have to follow a deal, not create it from the ground up.
Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you. And thank you for revealing my identity, although I thought I would be discreet. Thank you. I thank you, Ambassador Pickering, and the panel also. Thank you for the very informative subject. I just would like to, regarding the issue of security, during the meeting, the last meeting, I hope I'm not revealing any secrets, they were really discussing three tracks, which are the security track, economic track, and political track. Look at the arrangement. This is the American side arrangement. Security, political came at the end. Anyway, some Arab participants were worried that maybe the United States means that security and the economic track are more important than the political one. And the United States will focus on security and the economic track and forget about the political or later. Regarding the issue of security, anyway, it was decided that a general, I think, General Allen, I think, should go there to that area, should visit Gaza, and then they stopped there and they said that then they will visit Israel to see what are the security needs of Israel, as if they need really more security. Because we know that Israel, regarding security, the United States is committed to the security of Israel and to keep Israel stronger than all the Arab countries combined at any time. So what are you talking about security? With the Iron Domes now, with the $40 billion recently, anyway, this will worry for the Palestinians. They were talking about the minor, this was an issue, very sensitive, the minor swaps of land, which are equal in size and value. I know in size they can decide, but in value, God knows who will decide that. Now, regarding the point I think Mr. Aronson raised, which is very interesting, that unless we take the insecurity or the security of both sides into considerations, you cannot have peace. You can have peace now, but in the long run, with new generations, they will not accept what have been approved or agreed upon today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, very much. You touched on a number of points, happily many of which we did not consider. And I say that only because I want to make sure, in fact, we don't mislead you in any response. I think that, secondly, I myself believe that the security of a state depends first on its own armed forces, but that may be necessary but not sufficient, particularly in a case where there have been long-standing disputes and conflicts, depending upon solely your armed forces, without agreements and arrangements. That, in my view, is what we now have. Occupation is the answer to one side's security, but it is not the answer to the other side's aspirations for statehood. So our effort was to move away from sole dependence on military force on both sides and seek a set of arrangements which could provide for an answer to that problem without having to engage, if I could put it that way, the military forces of each side, to stop short of that particular effort. I hope that, in effect, people will look at this in that particular set of visions, because I think it is extremely important if we just go back to a situation where there is a standoff, no peace, no agreement on borders, no agreement on the security arrangements that can help to reinforce that, we will be exactly where we are now, but much worse in the future. And I don't see this in anybody's interest, most of all at this stage, in the interest of Palestinians.
Gentleman back in the corner.
Samar Chatterjee from SEIU Foundation. Ambassador Pickering, you've been fairly influential for a long time, and since this administration chose you to do some investigation in Libya, I figured you have some corner with the administration. Given that this new strategy that you're talking about, I'm sure it's not a new strategy, it must have been discussed during Camp David, and still not. So how do we make sure that this is a serious approach and has the backing of this last 4 years of Obama administration, which will go out? Are they going to push this thing and make it their legacy?
Let's take, may we take 3 questions, 2 more, and then return to this. Said Erica.
So thank you. My name is Said Erica, and I'm a Palestinian journalist. My question is to Mr. Aronson. You mentioned the notion that we cannot want peace more than they do. I wonder if that is really not a ploy, or in fact it can be a ploy by the United States, because after all, it is really the sustainer of Israel and hence the sustainer of the occupation. And I wonder if, you know, in the view of the wise men and women of the administration, have seen perhaps it is really in the interest of the United States, at least in the short or medium term, to sustain the occupation. Thank you.
Bill Harrop, Ambassador Harrop.
Thank you. My name is William Harrop. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer and former ambassador to Israel. I was very impressed by a short editorial by our moderator in the last issue of the bulletin on the settlements in the occupied territories, in which Phil said that he really thought that the only hope, if I read it correctly, the only hope for reaching a settlement would be a change in the opinion of the Israeli public. And until the Israeli public really felt comfortable in seeking peace and really wished to do it, would they be able to determine the position of their government? Now, I came a little bit late, perhaps I missed a discussion of this subject, but I think it's a crucial point. And how do you see the possibilities and the methods of changing Israeli public opinion to, in fact, desire peace, desire a settlement?
Bill, may I just add that in emphasizing the need for hope and confidence that there can be peace and security, I didn't mean to diminish giving attention to tangible security issues as part of a much larger complex of issues. And as I listened to our panelists and I read the report, I believe that you are focusing on the tangible security issues. You are not addressing the psychological, the historic, the pathological reasons which have often led Israelis, sometimes Palestinians, to say that it's hopeless, that everything, all of our problems can be explained by insecurity, and that security is a bottomless well. I remember for years in the Department of State, we would say, we are providing generous military assistance to the State of Israel, the latest technology in unprecedented quantities to give them confidence to make peace. That focus on making Israel's security unassailable, as Geoffrey Aronson has said, has not succeeded. But I take it, and I'd like the panelists to clarify, that your focus is what would be a vital part of a much larger package of issues that have to be resolved in an effort to untangle real security issues from all of these other more cosmic psychological and political issues.
Very difficult to abstract away from the public opinion and politics.
Well, I think that's right. I think first let me say to Said, you're sitting in a bright light, and so even though you are a bright light yourself, I didn't see it come through. And I want to welcome you here warmly. It's been a long time since we conversed, but you've carried the can, if I could put it that way, for a long time on this issue, and I'm pleased to see you here.
I think you're talking about Saad Arkan. I am Saeed Arkan.
Okay, then I'm not talking about Saad. But anyway, thank you for your question. I think most of the questions have gone to the issue of how do you achieve motivating the American government to take a more robust role. And the answer that Jeff gave, which I thought was not unreasonable, even though it wasn't conclusive, was that you have a Secretary of State who now seems to be interested in moving this ahead, seemingly supported by a president, which is the difference between our presenting this to a yawning and sleepy crowd of 5 sometime in November, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not so far apart, and a vibrant crowd of 100 who are here chasing us hard on a set of questions that is fundamentally important. And I think that, okay, I don't know whether this is going to work out miraculously or not. And Bill Harrop knows better than anybody else that none of us advise the U.S. government in ways that are going to make it move on this particularly difficult issue. All we're trying to do is to say, here's one piece that seemed to have been surrounded by more mythology than reality. And it's the point that Phil made here. And could we find a way of slicing through both the mythology but providing a set of possible answers based on the extensive experience that we've had with both parties and a hard look at the region, and indeed many of the commentaries of thoughtful people from both sides. So that's where we are. So in effect, we may have removed the third hurdle on the track, but you're all right to say the first and second are pretty high and they're pretty big, and they have a lot to do with the U.S. government. One of the reasons why I thought Jeff was so apt in his comment is that we may be in a position of seeing some hard work done on the first and second hurdle, and something like this or something similar to it may well serve a useful purpose. That was the basis on which we prepared it, and our hope is that it will move in that direction. I don't think I've answered all the questions. Jeff will finish up with all the hard ones.
This point about we can't want peace more than the parties themselves. The question was, maybe the status quo, in a sense, serves U.S. interests as its leaders understand it. Well, that's the verdict of history here. Countries over decades don't deceive themselves in the execution of their policy and survive. So in that sense, yes, you could argue that the policy as it's been expressed over the years is a legitimate, correct expression of where its leaders see U.S. interests. Now, that can change. Certainly, number one, it can respond to unprecedented changes in the international environment. Countries don't usually modify their policies out of a sense of enlightened goodwill or self-interest. They usually do it when their backs are against the wall and they're faced with a series of unpalatable choices. Certainly. But if we look at the context in which this particular statement has been made in past years, the idea that the U.S. can't want peace more than the parties themselves, it's always invariably declared in the context of rationalizing the failure of U.S. policy, right? Certainly it was the case in the settlement freeze issue. You can Google the phrase and you'll see it when the Secretary of State has made it. So, and also when President Obama has made it. He hasn't made it in the context of declaring a victory. He's made it in the context of trying to explain why the U.S. has come up short. What we're asking, in a sense, or what we're doing is holding a light up to this essential contradiction at the heart of U.S. declared policy. Again, a vital national security interest of the U.S., there aren't so many of those in the world. This is what our own leadership has, over the course of time, defined as a vital security interest. Now, the question you can ask is, well, maybe it isn't. So maybe we can afford not to engage in the kind of manner that we've suggested. Well, again, history suggests that in fact is also the case. Right? We aren't running away from the facts of history as we feel we see them. But our argument is that the true attainment of the vital security interests of the U.S. as the U.S. itself has to define them can be expressed in a win-win understanding that addresses the fundamental interests of all parties and creates the foundation for stability between the parties themselves and, more broadly speaking, in the region itself. And certainly one needs to make an argument that U.S. policy in this part of the world has not attained the kind of achievement of stability that has benefited all parties, including the U.S. So that's that point. The other point that Bill Harrop makes is an important one, but again, it's the subtext of our argument. U.S. leadership is vital not only to reach an agreement, but to transform the public environment in which peace is achieved. The U.S. retains the ability to change people's views of their futures and what's important to them and what isn't. And it's not only the U.S. Anwar Sadat did it. Jimmy Carter did it in his day as well. They weren't necessarily popular moves in those days. But nonetheless, if a U.S. leader makes clear that he is intent upon achieving an objective, or his interest in achieving an objective, is at least equal to, if not greater than those of the people surrounding him or sitting opposite him, then he has a chance to win. But if you don't come into the game prepared to play according to those rules, you lose. And that's when the U.S. loses, in Palestine and elsewhere. If we want a settlement freeze, for example, then we want one, whether the other parties do or don't. But if it turns out that they don't want one more than we want one, they win. And that's what would happen. So I think that's an object lesson for people like Secretary of State Kerry, who now is jumping into this without, to be honest, a very clear idea of what's coming next. And that's a prescription for failure, I'm afraid.
And PJ, do you have a comment?
Please, I'd like to address what Ambassador Harp raised, because there's a very pertinent point, and the Ambassador of the State of Affairs. On the issue of security of Israel, that's of course, there's a piece in where we address the essence of the U.S. strategic commitment to Israel, as Ambassador Pickering said. Okay, that had to be parted a little bit, okay? It'd be great if we could also make a same commitment to Palestine in a way. I think that's a neat thing to think about in the future, strategic commitment. Why not? It sits along the Jordan River. It borders a key ally. It borders the Kingdom of Jordan. I think it'd be very interesting. But one of the big lessons I've taken from working this conundrum on the ground, and I stated it in the recent chapter in Ambassador Kirch's book that we did for him, at the end of the day, security is not the issue. This to me has been the big revelation of being out there for almost 30 years. Forget it. And I'm prepared to back it up. And I have to be very careful in what audience I'm saying this, but in one way I don't. If you look at the recent documentary coming in Israel, the 5 Shin Bet chiefs were interviewed. Yeah. Watch it. Gatekeepers, thank you. Watch it. All right, I think it's fundamentally fascinating. And we know that Steve from the USSC sitting here in the front audience, we work with 3 of those guys. So it's not the issue at the end of the day. It's an essential issue. This was the great argument through Iraq and Afghanistan. We've got to have security, then we can open the market. Yes, to a point. But I will also argue there's been a very interesting transition. It happened in 2010. That mark has been met. That mark has been met in terms of at least dealing with the Palestinian Authority. As Ambassador Pickering said, it's not a pretty mark. We're not trying to paint. What we're saying is the essence of what needs to be achieved on the ground and go forward, and that has been met in 2010. What is it? It's a sense that now the security situation in Palestine has reached a certain lull. Now, again, another PhD paper, yes, but okay. I can handle any argument, and I love to be argued against and proven wrong. I've been out there long enough. But in essence, there's a certain pinnacle that has reached in the West Bank. And whose assessment is that, am I saying? P.J. Dermer? Yeah, but okay, who's P.J. Dermer? Talk to the head of Central Command and talk to the head of Shin Bet. So the turning, sir, back to your question, is the IDF and the Israeli security services have made a fundamental mental change in their assessment of the need where to go in the future. This is big. It's big. The populace, no. No, the Israeli populace, we're not talking about.
I think that's a nice place to pause.
Okay.
The people, public, and not only the security people, need to be persuaded about what will happen if the government of Israel makes these massive concessions and changes in the policies that would be necessary to create a Palestinian state. There's huge fear among people who intellectually realize that 2 states is needed, that it will fail because they just don't know what's going to happen afterwards. The plan that you have outlined is a way of creating that confidence. It can be a positive, peaceful outcome, a secure outcome in exchange for these major compromises, in some ways sacrifices. But let's return to the audience. I can't see very well in the back row, but
It's me, Phil.
Yeah.
Tom.
Yeah.
Tom Getman, an NGO executive. Thank you. Thank you, panel. I want to follow up on Bill Harrop's comment and something you said, Ambassador Pickering. And the other Phil, said there has to be a third-party mechanism. 6 of us or more in the room were at a Wilson Center meeting the other day with an Israeli negotiator, a Palestinian negotiator, and the usual suspects. And after Barbara Herman talked about how positive she was about how the time had come for a negotiation, all 4 of the panelists said it's terrible, the fuse is short. History usually turns on an accident, surprise, an assassination, somebody comes out of prison. When you say third-party mechanism, who are you talking about? When Phil was Consul General, he helped those of us in the room that served on the ground in NGOs to understand that we worked closely together. And he kept us alive and kept us from getting kicked out of the country.
Question. We've got
so
many more questions.
What is the mechanism? What is the mechanism, especially since there's a short fuse? And can we partner better, especially with UNSO? Is UNSO going to be a security force on the ground?
The proposal in the paper is something called the IMPO, led by the United States. There's no reason why UNSO couldn't exist alongside it. It does things that this particular organization probably won't do in places like Egypt. But this organization is specifically concentrated in the area now occupied, or in Gaza, hopefully, although each place will be different. So I urge you to read the report to get a full answer. PJ outlined some of the principles.
Jerome Siegel.
I want to ask you a security question. It's a little bit broader than your report, and I hope in particular Ambassador Pickering that you'll speak to this. Because I haven't read the report, but as I see it, it pretty much addresses the kind of security issues that you face in negotiations. If across the table you've got, from the Palestinians, on the Israeli side, you've got an Israeli government which has already accepted the idea of a Palestinian state and is trying to work out the security issues. But we don't really have that today, and contrary to, I don't know what some people think, most people in Israel think that the security situation got worse after withdrawing from Lebanon, and it got worse after withdrawing from Gaza. They face missile threats from both sides that they didn't face before, and they're concerned today about what would happen if they pulled out of the West Bank and there was a Palestinian state. Not because they fear that you can't address the security issues that you have when Abu Mazen is there and you've got the cooperation, but rather what happens if you have Hamas taking over, or some other even more hostile to permanent peace with Israel Palestinian organization. So the question is really, if you take it as a given, which I know Jeff, you may disagree with this, but if you take it as a given that Israel's security situation, in fact, will be worse if there's a Palestinian state next to Israel that's headed by a hostile regime that wasn't part of the negotiations and isn't committed to the end of conflict provisions of it, then how do you address that security concern that Israelis have?
Nothing in this world says everybody will be angels for life. What I think is important to realize is the longer Israel continues under occupation, the more likely the disappointing result you portray is going to happen.
Yeah.
Sam Lewis and then Andrea Farsa.
I'm really satisfied.
This room is full of people who've labored in this vineyard for 40 years at least. We have at least 3 ex-ambassadors to Israel here. We don't always agree, but have made brilliant contributions. I've only had a chance to glance through this as we've been sitting here. I hadn't seen it before. And one thing jumps out at me about the formula. I want to get down and away from these broader issues to a couple of formulas in the document. And this line, which is in your executive summary, it specifically does not address many other significant issues, including, for example, Jerusalem, borders, and refugees. The 3 things which almost everybody agrees are the toughest. And the idea that you can settle the security issues without settling at least one of them boggles the mind. And I don't understand two things. One, what security arrangements in here would apply to a Jerusalem settlement, if any? And secondly, how do you come to this conclusion that there would be no guns at all to defend this multinational group, not against the Palestinians in Ramallah, but against the Palestinians in Damascus in the future, or in Baghdad, or just across the river? This game isn't going to be over with the outsiders. And this is all focused on the inside security issues. And those two things, seem to me, are gaps.
Andrea. Sure.
Andrea Farsak, retired Foreign Service officer and spouse of a Palestinian American who has experienced the occupation for, well, the whole time. It's a book recently, it's by Rashid Khalidi, and I realize he has a certain point of view. But the essence is that it's Menachem Begin's vision of a solution to the Palestinian question that the Israeli government has, since Begin, followed through on. So that the Israelis are really getting everything they want now. And as the Israeli public moves more to the right, it seems like currently the prospects are very bad. How do you get a government that is getting what it thinks it wants and is proceeding apace to Judaize Jerusalem more, to take over more of the West Bank? They're evicting an 82-year-old woman from her house in Hebron this week. There was a demonstration, a violent demonstration at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Meanwhile, we're sponsoring legislation in the Congress to give Israel the visa waiver, and there's a proposal that they be allowed for security reasons, which those of us who know Israeli security concerns covers just about everything, to ethnically profile, as they've been doing all along, Palestinian Americans trying to enter Israel to visit their families and so on. So my main question is, how do you get the Israelis to move when their political system, their leadership, is getting everything that it wants?
You want to go ahead with Sam?
Thank you, sir. Appreciate you being here. Two things. First off, the intent was that the regional players would be brought into the picture. Number one, it's a regional structure. The Jordanians are involved, and the Arab League is involved. Everyone is most welcome, and they're also most welcome to have a presence within the West Bank. That's part of the thinking behind this. This is a very open system. Any of the UN organizations, MFO, we could even start somewhere like that. In the bigger picture, in an opening, I said that given the dynamic changes on the ground with the Arab revolutions in the spring, I would be open to putting forth to the team or to the administration that perhaps, just if nothing else, prima facie, you have something that's armed and looks military. That's not a problem. But what we're talking about is folks at Allenby, folks at the crossings that are in uniform, that are customs border enforcement. They have weapons to protect themselves, security issues that EU ban laid out for me. The essence is not to develop a robust military organization to protect from threats from the outside at this writing. Now also, don't forget, the tools that we have in the trade now are unprecedented by what we had about a decade ago in order to do that. And the threat realistically from Jordan to Syria can change, and nothing more than present. And I'm willing to consider that. Thank you.
I'd like to ask for two more questions on the agenda. I apologize if maybe...
Could I just do lots of questions here about why is the U.S. government where it is, and why isn't it attacking this problem with greater vigor, and why doesn't it deal with all of the perceived, and there are many of them, inconsistencies, prejudices, bad treatment, and all the rest. And I have to tell you, we did not write the report on that subject. Similarly, Sam, you raise a very good question that the configuration of Jerusalem will determine a great deal about how this particular organization plays its role. And my answer is we have developed a paradigm which is applicable to Jerusalem, just as our paradigm is applicable to the territory that will emerge, we hope, from whatever border swaps are engaged. But we didn't attempt to say how big it is how robust in various places, that will be determined by military officials and experts on the ground. And so we didn't carry it that far for all the various reasons you raised. But we didn't attempt to try to design a whole peace settlement because we knew, in fact, that would end up misleading people. And decide we had neither the time, the inspiration, the effort, or even the Norwegian money in hand to be able to do all of that. Hopefully other people will contribute it, but I think it's important to make. And I think that just to address these two questions, I think that question number one is obviously a question that we have to try to resolve at the ballot box with the Congress and our lobbying with the executive branch. And Senator Kerry has started off. I think question number two is for the people who will have to negotiate a settlement, hopefully with inspiration and maybe with reasonable ideas from us and from many other sources to help them through the difficulties.
I'd like to solicit questions from two board members of the audience who are not retired Foreign Service officers. Then we will return. Then we can shift.
Then we come back to the real world.
Then we can shift to other questions. Judge Grossman.
Herbert Grossman, I'm a retired judge. It seems to me that
we have a job for you.
I have to hear what I have to say. It seems to me that the premise of your plan here is something that you and everyone in the audience knows is not the case, and that is that the Palestinians would accept a Jewish state in the Middle East, will accept Israel, and that's just not been the history of what the struggle is about. And you're willing to, and so what you're really doing is letting the conflict continue, but moving Israel out of the West Bank and ethnically cleansing the Jews out of the West Bank, and then letting the conflict continue, and to show that that's basically what you're doing. You won't even touch the issue of refugees or the right of return, as long as the Palestinians maintain the position that all the descendants of the people who left in 1948 are entitled to go back to Israel. They are not willing to accept a Jewish state in the Middle East. And everything that you're planning is really saying we're going to let the conflict restart after we pull all the Jews out of the West Bank and Jerusalem.
Judge Grossman, excuse me for interrupting, but that is precisely what this panel is not discussing. They're discussing one important element of a much larger set of problems, and they disclaim that they have tried to address these other problems, and that is the subject of this forum. So thank you for your comment. Let me ask for another question. Leonard Bowling.
The question that haunts me is this. The nearest we have ever come to a settlement of the problem was on the 29th of November 1947, when the UN General Assembly endorsed Security Council 181, the title of which was Plan of Partition with Economic Union. And it went on to spell out in great detail how these two entities belong together. They must work together. There must be a kind of partnership in order to make peace. Well, that was scuttled. It never happened. But it seems to me that the issue is still unresolved. You will never get security that Israel feels is adequate unless they have control of the whole of the area from the Mediterranean to the Jordan Valley. And they have it now. And they're not going to turn it loose. So why kid ourselves about this? We need to get back somehow to the basic issue of how can we find a way to build a real partnership between these two people. They've got to share the land. They've got to share this opportunity. And if we put our minds on how we could support the creation of a genuine partnership of some kind between the two, we might get somewhere.
Thank you, Landrum. Do any of our panelists would like to respond?
Yeah. Our argument is that it's not in U.S. interest to let the inmates run the asylum. It's as simple as that almost. The U.S. has an interest above and beyond satisfying or entertaining the particular needs of each party. Our argument is the U.S. has a vital national security interest in an agreement. And to the extent that that national interest exists, we sought to define which areas of the conflict are most important to the vital interests of the U.S., and this relates to what Sam said. We didn't address the question of refugees, because again, that's the number and the placement and so forth of refugees does not touch upon, in and of itself, the vital security interests of the U.S. Where it does, we have to be prepared to draw a picture of what kind of picture is a tangible and even territorial expression of our interests. Those relate to the powers of Palestinian sovereignty, and those relate to the elements of Israeli and mutual security. Above and beyond those issues are many more, and it's very easy to and I can do it myself, to explain how inadequate this particular framework is. But it's an exercise, in some respects for the first time, for an American audience to seek to build from the bottom up an articulation of what American interests are at stake here, and to make the argument that if those are our interests, and this is the kind of picture one can draw to express them, how can you get from here to there? And we answer the question, you have to want what you want, more than the other guys want what they want. It's almost as simple as that. If one reads, for example, the transcript of the protocols between Jimmy Carter and Menachem Begin and his cabinet in March 1979 that were released on the eve of President Obama's visit to Israel, they're extraordinary. Here we have the Prime Minister of Israel saying to the President of the U.S., Mr. President, with all due respect, I've gone to my cabinet and they don't agree with X, and there isn't anything I can do about it. And President Carter says, well, today is Friday, come back to me Monday and we'll talk about it again. Speak to your cabinet over the weekend and we'll talk about it again on Monday. The point being, fix it. And it was fixed. Now, it's not as simple as that, certainly, but it does give an expression to the kind of commitment that's required. If President Carter had said at that point, well, I can't really want this more than you do, my friend, then we're finished. Well, that's what the protocols.
We're running over our time, and I understand that the representative from ABC has a question, and there may be one or two other questions on other topics that are not directly related to our agenda today.
Hi, this question is for Ambassador Pickering.
Why am I surprised?
I was wondering if you have any response to the subpoena that Representative Issa issued today. And then also I was wondering if when you took on the job to oversee the ARB some 8 months ago, did you have any idea that it was going to become this much of a political issue?
No, I have no comment on the first. I've just heard about it, and obviously we'll want to talk to my friends in the State Department and seek legal advice and all the other things that go with it. And so I'll wait. And of course, I had no idea, but a deep sense of put it this way, potential concern that anything that was so politicized at the beginning would not necessarily end up without some political ramifications at the end.
Is there another question? Then let me thank Ambassador Pickering. Sorry?
No, right here. Right here.
Please.
I'm Steve Colecki with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. I just wanted to say to the entire panel that I think you provided a very compelling argument for U.S. leadership. And I'm really grateful for that. I also think that the focus on security is an extremely helpful contribution to what needs to happen in the conflict. So I think what we're picking up in the room is a great deal of frustration with all of the historic problems that have existed in trying to seek peace, but I think you've made a genuine contribution to that effort and a very compelling argument for U.S. leadership. The U.S. does have to want it more. Thank you.
Thank you all, and a special thanks to Ambassador Pickering, Geoffrey Aronson, and